10 minutes, 600 seconds. The time it takes to brew a pot of coffee, drive a few miles down the highway, or scroll through your morning social media. On a foggy morning in North Carolina, it was also exactly how long it took for a routine flight to transform into an unsurvivable tragedy that claimed 7 lives, including NASCAR legend Greg Biffle's family and friends. What makes this timeline so haunting isn't just its brevity, but how many opportunities for a different outcome existed within those 10 minutes, each one slipping away faster than anyone in that citation could process. At 10:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Cessna citation rolled down runway 10 at Statesville Regional Airport. The takeoff was normal, unremarkable even, the kind of departure that happens thousands of times a day across America.
5 souls were on board: Greg Biffle himself, Dennis Dutton, a 67-year-old former Delta Airlines captain, his son Jack Dutton, a college student in Auburn's professional flight program, and 2 others whose presence would add weight, both literal and figurative, to what was about to unfold. The weather was marginal, ceilings around 1,200 feet, visibility dancing around 5 miles with persistent drizzle, but nothing that would have prevented a legal departure, nothing that screamed danger, nothing that suggested these would be the last 10 minutes of their lives. Within 30 seconds of wheels leaving the ground, the citation was climbing through 500 feet. The gear was retracting, the initial climb profile looked normal, and somewhere in that cockpit, someone was likely already thinking about the flight ahead, the destination, maybe even what they'd have for lunch when they arrived. But physics and fate were already conspiring. As the nose pitched up for the climb, evidence suggests that the right-hand nose baggage door, a door that should have been latched, a door that had no cockpit indication if it wasn't properly secured, began to open. Not dramatically at first, probably just a crack, enough to create some unusual noise, some vibration that didn't quite match what experienced pilots expect from a citation during climb. By the 1-minute mark, the aircraft had climbed through 1,000 feet and was entering the bottom of that 1,200-foot cloud layer. This is where the timeline begins its deadly acceleration. The transition from visual to instrument flight is always a critical phase, requiring pilots to shift their scan from outside to inside, from looking at the horizon to trusting their instruments completely. But this transition was happening just as something was going wrong, just as unusual sounds and vibrations were demanding attention, just as decision trees were beginning to branch in directions nobody had briefed for. At approximately 90 seconds into the flight, approaching 1,500 feet, something changed in that cockpit. We know this because the aircraft's climb rate began to vary, the heading started to shift slightly, and the power settings were being adjusted. These aren't dramatic changes visible from the ground, but in the data, they tell a story of a crew beginning to recognize that something isn't right.
The question at this moment wasn't whether to continue or return. That decision was probably already made. The question was, what exactly were they dealing with and how urgent was it? 2 minutes. The citation had now climbed to approximately 2,000 feet, barely above the cloud layer, when the first major decision point arrived. Continue climbing to gain altitude and time to troubleshoot, or begin an immediate return to the field. The data shows they chose to return, beginning a turn back toward the airport while simultaneously reducing power and starting a descent. This decision, made in the span of seconds, would cascade through the remaining 8 minutes like dominoes falling in slow motion. Here's what's crucial to understand about this moment. At 2,000 feet, turning back toward a runway you just departed from, in marginal weather, with an unknown problem, you're not just flying an airplane anymore. You're managing a complex equation where every variable is changing simultaneously. Your altitude is decreasing, your energy state is degrading, your navigation is complicated by reduced visibility, and your workload has just increased exponentially. And you have maybe 8 minutes to solve it all. 2 minutes 30 seconds. The aircraft was now descending through 1,800 feet, airspeed beginning to decrease, and this is likely when the first radio transmission occurred. The voice, which evidence suggests was Jack Dutton, announced they had an issue. They were returning to the field. The calmness in that voice is both professional and heartbreaking. No panic, no drama, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement that something had gone wrong and they were handling it.
But behind that calm voice, the cockpit was likely anything but serene. 3 minutes. The Citation was now level at approximately 1,500 feet, caught in that deadly space between the ground and the clouds where forward visibility is marginal and vertical options are limited. The aircraft had completed roughly 90 degrees of turn back toward the airport, but was still several miles out. At this point, the crew faced another critical decision: which runway to aim for. They could continue the turn to come back to runway 10, where they'd departed, or set up for the opposite direction on runway 28. The data shows they initially chose runway 10, beginning to align for what would have been a tight pattern back to their departure runway. But here's where the timeline becomes truly tragic. 3 minutes and 30 seconds into the flight, something caused them to reconsider. Maybe it was the wind, maybe the weather looked worse in that direction, maybe they realized their energy state wouldn't support that approach profile. Whatever the reason, the aircraft began turning away from runway 10, starting a new trajectory toward runway 28. This decision to change runways, made under extreme pressure with degrading conditions, would cost them precious time and distance they couldn't afford to lose. 4 minutes. The halfway point of this tragedy. The Citation was now roughly abeam the airport, flying southwest, maintaining about 1,500 feet. The gear was coming down. Think about that for a moment. 4 minutes into what should have been a routine flight, they were already configuring for landing. The landing gear on a Citation creates enormous drag. It's like deploying speed brakes that you can't retract quickly. Once that gear is down, your options narrow dramatically. You're committed to landing somewhere, somehow, soon. The decision to lower the gear this early tells us something critical about the crew's assessment of their situation. They believed they needed to land immediately. Not eventually, not after troubleshooting, but right now. This urgency suggests they knew something we can only guess at from the data. Maybe they could see damage to the engine. Maybe the vibration was getting worse. Maybe they could smell smoke or hear sounds that indicated imminent failure. Whatever they knew, it was enough to make them configure for landing while still miles from the runway. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The flaps were beginning to extend. Another irreversible commitment to landing. With gear down and flaps extending, the Citation was transforming from a jet into a glider, trading its remaining energy for drag in preparation for landing. But this aircraft was heavy, loaded with 5 people and fuel, and the math was becoming unforgiving. Every second with gear and flaps extended was bleeding energy they would desperately need. 5 minutes. The timeline had reached its point of no return. The Citation was now fully configured for landing, but still nearly 5 miles from the runway threshold. At this configuration and weight, the aircraft needed every bit of its available thrust just to maintain altitude. If an engine had failed or was producing reduced thrust, if the drag from an open baggage door was greater than expected, if any of a dozen variables wasn't perfect, the energy equation would no longer balance. The flight path data here becomes erratic, showing altitude fluctuations that suggest the crew was fighting to maintain level flight. Small climbs followed by larger descents, speed increases followed by decreases, the signature of pilots pulling every lever, adjusting every control, trying to stretch the laws of physics just a little further. They were no longer flying the airplane so much as negotiating with it, trading altitude for airspeed, then airspeed for distance, then distance for the hope of making the runway. 6 minutes. The Citation had now traveled approximately 15 miles from its takeoff point, still configured for landing, still struggling to maintain altitude. The radio transmissions, if the recorded audio is authentic, suggest the crew was still calm, still professional, still fighting. But the mathematics of flight were becoming brutal. At maximum weight, with gear and flaps down, possibly on one engine or with reduced thrust, the Citation simply couldn't maintain altitude indefinitely. Physics doesn't care about determination or skill or how badly you need to make it home. 7 minutes. The aircraft was now on what should have been a base leg for runway 28, but the altitude was wrong, too low for a normal approach, too high for the distance remaining.
This is the cruel paradox of emergency approaches. You need altitude for safety, but altitude means distance from the runway. You need to descend to land, but descending costs energy you might need later. The crew was trapped between these competing demands, trying to thread a needle that was getting smaller with each passing second. The witnesses on the ground, including personnel at the fixed base operator, could now hear the aircraft. The sound was wrong, they'd later report. Not the normal whine of a citation on approach, but something labored, struggling. Inside the cockpit, alarms were likely sounding. Gear warnings, configuration warnings, maybe stall warnings as the speed decayed. Each alarm demanding attention the crew couldn't spare, adding noise to an already overwhelming sensory environment. 8 minutes. The citation was turning final for runway 28, but the geometry was all wrong. Too low, too slow, too far out. This is where the earlier decisions compounded into catastrophe. The early configuration for landing, necessary as it seemed at the time, had bled too much energy. The runway change from 10 to 28 had cost precious distance and altitude. The marginal weather had prevented them from seeing these problems developing until visual contact with the ground made them undeniable. In the cockpit, the crew would have known they were in trouble. When you're configured for landing and you can see the runway but your altitude and distance don't match up, you have seconds to make impossible decisions. Add power and try to stretch the glide, risking a stall. Accept a landing short of the runway and try to control the impact. Look for an alternate landing site, each option offering only degrees of disaster rather than escape from it. 9 minutes. The citation was now aligned with runway 28 but losing altitude steadily. The flight data shows airspeed decreasing towards stall speed, altitude decreasing below any safe approach profile. If both engines were operating, they were at maximum thrust. If one had failed, the remaining engine was screaming at its limits. The crew was pulling back on the yoke, trying to arrest the descent, but physics had taken over. The aircraft simply didn't have the energy to reach the runway. This is perhaps the cruelest minute of all. They could see the runway. After 9 minutes of fighting, troubleshooting, and maneuvering, safety was visible through the windscreen. 1,800 feet. That's all that separated them from survival. In a car, that's a third of a mile. In a struggling aircraft at low altitude, it might as well have been on the moon. The controls were becoming mushy as airspeed decayed. The stall warning was likely blaring continuously now. The ground was rising toward them, not in the controlled way of a landing, but in the inexorable approach of impact. 9 minutes, 30 seconds. The citation was now below tree height, still 1,800 feet short of the runway. Inside the cockpit, training would have taken over. Maintain aircraft control. That's the first rule of any emergency. Even when impact is inevitable, you fly the airplane until it won't fly anymore. The crew was likely still making control inputs, still trying to stretch those final seconds, still refusing to give up even when mathematics had already determined the outcome. 9 minutes, 45 seconds. The final seconds. The citation was now skimming trees, the runway still visible but unreachable ahead. There's a phenomenon in these final moments that survivors of other crashes have described. Time seems to slow down. Individual trees become visible. Sounds become crystal clear. The brain, flooded with adrenaline, processes information at incredible speed, even though nothing can be done with that information. For the 5 souls on board, these seconds must have felt like minutes, watching the ground rise, feeling the controls lose authority, knowing what was coming, but powerless to prevent it. 10 minutes. Impact. 1,800 feet short of runway 28. The citation struck trees and terrain at high speed, the fuselage breaking apart on impact. The force was unsurvivable. 700 gallons of jet fuel ignited instantly, creating a fireball visible for miles. On the runway itself, another aircraft, an Aztec that had followed the citation out for departure, was landing on the same runway, its pilot witnessing the fireball erupting just short of his landing point. The contrast couldn't be starker. One aircraft landing safely, while another burned just yards away. The timeline was over. 10 minutes from a normal takeoff to unsurvivable impact. 600 seconds in which dozens of decisions were made.
each one seeming reasonable at the time, each one narrowing the options for what came next. The baggage door that shouldn't have been open,
The weather that shouldn't have been quite so marginal. The configuration that happened too early. The runway change that cost precious energy. The altitude that bled away faster than expected. The runway that remained just out of reach. What makes this timeline so devastating is not that the crew made mistakes. By all accounts, they fought professionally and skillfully against cascading failures. What makes it devastating is how quickly aviation can transition from routine to catastrophic. 10 minutes earlier, this was a normal flight with experienced pilots in a well-maintained aircraft. 10 minutes later, 7 people were gone, leaving behind grieving families and a racing community in shock. The investigation will eventually reveal technical details about what failed and why. The baggage door latch mechanism will be examined.
The engine will be torn down to determine if debris was ingested. The maintenance records will be scrutinized. The pilot qualifications will be verified. But none of that will change the fundamental tragedy of this timeline. In just 10 minutes, a series of individually manageable problems combined into an unsurvivable emergency. For those of us who fly, this timeline is a stark reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, and how decisions made in the heat of an emergency can cascade in ways we don't anticipate. The crew of this citation didn't have the luxury of hindsight. They didn't know that configuring early would cost them energy they'd need later. They didn't know that changing runways would put them just out of reach of safety. They didn't know that 10 minutes after a normal takeoff, physics would win its brutal argument with determination.
Each decision point in these 10 minutes could have led to a different outcome. If the baggage door had been properly latched, if the weather had been just slightly better, if they'd climbed higher before turning back, if they'd continued to Charlotte instead of returning, if they'd kept the gear up longer, if they'd stuck with the first runway choice. If. But that's the nature of accident timelines. They're built on chains of events that seem inevitable in hindsight, but were anything but predetermined as they unfolded. The radio transmissions, calm and professional to the end, remind us that these weren't panicked amateurs. These were experienced aviators doing everything they could with the situation they faced. The fact that they came so close, just 1,800 feet from safety, makes the outcome even more tragic. They almost made it. After 10 minutes of fighting deteriorating conditions, managing cascading failures, and making split-second decisions, they almost pulled off the impossible. Almost. As we analyze this timeline, it's important to remember that these 10 minutes represent real people facing real decisions with real consequences. Dennis Dutton, with decades of airline experience trying to save his son and friends. Jack Dutton, just beginning his aviation career, helping his father fight an unwinnable battle. Greg Biffle and the others, trusting in the skill of their pilots, watching as the situation deteriorated beyond recovery. Each second of these 10 minutes mattered to them in ways our analysis can never fully capture. The lessons from these 10 minutes extend beyond just this accident. They remind us that in aviation, time is not just a measure of duration, but a resource that can be spent, saved, or squandered. Every decision costs time. Every configuration change costs energy. Every moment of uncertainty costs options. And sometimes, 10 minutes simply isn't enough to solve all the problems that aviation can throw at you simultaneously. The aftermath of those 10 minutes continues to ripple through the aviation and racing communities. Questions about pilot qualifications, aircraft maintenance, weather decisions, and emergency procedures will be debated for years. Procedures will be reviewed, training will be modified, and perhaps regulations will change. But nothing will change the fundamental truth that in just 10 minutes, a routine flight became a tragedy that claimed 7 lives. For the families and friends of those lost, these 10 minutes will forever represent the dividing line between before and after. Before, when their loved ones were alive, full of plans and dreams. After, when those plans and dreams ended in a field short of a runway in North Carolina. 10 minutes that changed everything. 10 minutes that can never be undone. 10 minutes that remind us how precious and precarious every flight really is.
The investigation continues, and more details will emerge. The NTSB will release its preliminary report, then, months later, its final findings. Technical causes will be identified, contributing factors will be listed, recommendations will be made. But they won't change what happened in those 10 minutes. They won't bring back the 7 souls lost. They will only help us understand how 10 minutes could go so wrong so fast, and hopefully prevent another 10-minute tragedy from claiming more lives. This is the reality of aviation accidents. They're not usually caused by single catastrophic failures, but by chains of events that compound faster than human ability to manage them. The Citation that crashed in North Carolina wasn't brought down by weather alone, or a mechanical failure alone, or pilot error alone. It was brought down by 10 minutes in which all these factors aligned in the worst possible way. 10 minutes that started with hope and ended with heartbreak. 10 minutes that killed 7 people and left a community searching for answers that even time may never fully provide.